So this video is going to take a look at the highlighted spec point from the AQA Christianity, Gender and Sexuality topic. So the development of biblical criticism, especially in the 19th century, and the resulting freedom to challenge traditional readings of passages such as 1 Timothy 2, 8-15. So the rise of biblical criticism. Let's first establish what biblical criticism is. So it's not negative, but rather it means the rational and analytical assessment of the Bible. So in terms of the background to the rise of biblical criticism, the Bible went through a big change after the Reformation in the 16th century, as it started to be translated from Greek and Latin into the vernacular, so into the languages that people actually spoke, like say English. The church also divided in the Reformation into Catholic and Protestant, and obviously that also impacted views of the Bible because of Martin Luther's belief in sola scriptura, and that kind of emphasis being there in the push for the Reformation. During the 19th century, people started to stop treating the Bible as a sacred text. People were starting to become more educated, and so more people had access to the Bible, and so they started to begin to look at it just like they would at any other text in the academic world. This led to the rise of what's known as liberal theology, as scholars started to analyse the Bible using modern thought that was informed increasingly by reason and science. So arising out of the work of prominent German scholars, such as Friedrich Schleiermacher, Protestant Christian German scholars, there started to be questions raised about the reliability and transmission of the ancient texts in the Bible and how they might fit with the new, more modern understanding of the world that came to us through science. So overall, during the 19th century, academics started to ask questions about the possible impact of context, time of writing, the role of the author, and the intention to our understanding of the messages in the Bible. Biblical criticism really rose to prominence in the 19th century against the background that we've just highlighted. The biblical critics closely examined the genre of the text of the Bible, the specific meaning of the words at the time they were written, and also how passages might fit into the Bible as a whole, as well as who actually is believed to have written the different texts. Some biblical scholars, such as Rudolf Bultmann, also looked specifically in great depth at the historical context of the text, or the sitz im Leben, or setting in life, to try and get further insight into what's really going on there in the biblical text. Now, there are many types of biblical criticism which, put together, contributed to the rise of what's known as liberal theology. Now, here are 5 different types of biblical criticism. So we have textual criticism, where scholars attempt to recover the original version of a text by comparing early different versions to try and work out if there was an original and what the original meaning was. Secondly, we have historical criticism, where scholars try and work out the historical context of a text. Thirdly, we have source criticism, where scholars try and work out whether the authors of the different books in the Bible used an existing story as the basis for their work, so they look for similarities between different accounts of the same event, for example. Form criticism, where scholars look at the Bible as a work of literature in the way that an English scholar might approach a novel or a play. And lastly, we have redaction criticism, where scholars investigate what the motivation may have been for the author writing a text at the time in which it was written. So here is a key text on the role and status of women for this gender topic that the AQA specification requires you to apply your knowledge of biblical criticism to. So it's from 1 Timothy 2 verses 8-15, and let's just quickly read through the text and remind ourselves what it is. So it says, "Therefore I want the men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing. I also want the women to dress modestly with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds, appropriate for women who profess to worship God. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety." So clearly, when we look at this text, it seems to present a very negative view around the role and status of women. It seems to suggest that women cannot have leadership roles, women must be quiet, they must submit to men. There's rules that they need to follow about how they dress, about how they conduct themselves, which don't seem to be the same for men. So on the surface, we can read the text in one particular way that's very negative towards women. What biblical criticism encourages us to do, though, is to look beyond the surface of the text and try to see what else could be actually going on. So, looking back at the text of 1 Timothy 2:8-15, a biblical scholar would maybe at first be interested in trying to understand the authorship and the context of this extract. So originally, 1 Timothy 2:8-15 is traditionally held to be part of a letter written by St. Paul, but it is possible, or maybe even likely, that the letter was actually written later, and so Paul may not be the author. Biblical scholars have come to this conclusion, have raised this point, because the content of this text seems quite inconsistent with the content of other letters that are perhaps more reliably attributed to Paul, such as his letter to the Romans, in which he refers to Phoebe, a female religious leader, as a deacon. In terms of context, it is possible and seems rather likely, to be honest, that this letter was actually written in response to a specific issue that the church in Ephesus was having. If so, the reply given by the author of this letter might be very specific and might be aimed towards a particular group of women, rather than laying out a general principle that should be followed by all Christians for all time about the role and status of women. Now, we know from other texts that aren't biblical that Ephesus was a centre for fertility rituals within the local pagan religions. Many of the women in Ephesus would have been linked to prostitution, and of course they would not have been educated or be used to actually being taught. Further, we note that this passage is from chapter 2, and chapter 1 sees Timothy being encouraged to combat heresy and false teachers. Chapter 3 goes on to list the qualities of good leaders and deacons of the church. And so it seems that this passage comes in the context of information being shared about the correct teaching and church leadership. Looking at the wider context, it's really possible that this passage, as we said, rather than being directed for all Christians at all times in terms of the role and status of women, is actually part of a letter written to a specific church whose congregation is poorly educated, unused to being taught, is living in a city associated with pagan fertility rituals, including prostitution, and that are maybe seeking an answer to a specific question or issue that they have. Now, obviously, understanding the text of 1 Timothy 2:8-15 in this more liberal way, taking into account possible context, would lead to totally different interpretations about the role and status of women in the Christian community today. Let's have a look at some excerpts from this text that's named in the spec, just to, again, have a think about how it can be interpreted differently through biblical scholarship. So we have here, I also want the women to dress modestly with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God. Now, on the surface, this seems to suggest that there are standards that Christian women should follow in their dress. And many Christians today who take this text at face value and don't engage in kind of different interpretations, or don't take note of the findings of biblical scholarship, may think that these are rules that need to be followed by Christian women today. However, biblical scholarship has led us to be interested in the context behind the text and the background to the letter. Now, it may be that this is targeting women, specific women in the congregation of this specific church in Ephesus who were not dressing correctly for church, perhaps being influenced by what they were used to in the pagan era. So they were just not dressing appropriately, and so it's directed towards them rather than giving specific rules that women today who are Christian need to be concerned with. Next we have, I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. Now, clearly, when taken literally, this is quite confronting. This verse can be used to argue that women should not be leaders in the Christian community and that they actually do not even have permission to speak. However, it's worth noting that this is the only time the Greek word authentine, translated as assume authority, is actually used in the New Testament, which may imply that this has a connotation that was, again, specific to this individual situation, rather than being a message for all Christians universally. The use of the term woman here rather than women could also be significant. So it may be that this text is actually directed towards a specific individual. The term authentine has a specific connotation of full power in the sense of a bully or like dominating behaviour. So perhaps this passage means that one specific woman should not try to bully a man, rather than being, again, guidance for all Christian women to follow today. We then have a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. Again, when taken literally, this verse can be used to argue that women should not speak in church and should submit to authority. However, many biblical scholars note the move from plural in the previous verse to the singular woman here. And maybe this is, again, a specific instruction to an individual. Perhaps there was shouting out during the service, and it may be that men and women sat separately, and so there was even shouting across the church. Some scholars also argue that full submission applies to submitting to the teachings being taught, so to obey the teachings of God fully, rather than meaning that a woman should submit to men. So here's an example of a 10 marker for this topic, and how you could bring in what we've just been talking about is maybe through one particular paragraph.